A sweeping round of U.S. tariffs is set to take effect soon. China is among the affected countries. We reached out to the Chinese embassy here in Washington. The response, quote, "China's position is consistent and firm. There are no winners in a trade war or tariff war. The unilateral tariffs imposed by the U.S. will not solve its own problems, nor will it benefit the two sides of the world." Mexico is another major U.S. trading partner bracing for tariffs next week. Canada is also targeted for U.S. tariffs next week. Economists warn that the 25% levies on Canadian goods, along with Ottawa's pledge of retaliatory tariffs, could have severe consequences for Canada's economy. So from the economy to tariffs, there's a lot to digest, and to help us unpack all of this is James Moore. He's the founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government and Society. Hello, James. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
All right, so, we've been talking a lot about this uncertainty with these tariffs on Mexican and Canadian goods. First they were on, then off, then starting in April, now next week. What's the impact of this back and forth?
Well, I think it's going to be rather dramatic. I've known President Trump for over 25 years, and I can tell you he's very serious on this. It doesn't mean that he can't change his mind between now and the deadline of March the 4th. But the fact is that he's going to be very serious on this. It's interesting, but the United States has had a long history as far as tariffs are concerned. President George Washington signed a law that allowed for tariffs to be imposed to be able to pay for the war, the Revolutionary War, and also to be able to help create manufacturing for the new USA. And things don't seem to have changed much. The Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930 actually had the very negative impact on the United States and the world in creating a much greater depression than we would have had in the 1930s. And so watching what's happening now when the world is so much more complicated than ever before is quite staggering. And been responsible at one time as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Commerce, I know very, very well what this all can ultimately mean. And so I think we're all watching with great caution.
Great caution here. Because along with China, the tariffs are aimed at the three largest trading partners of the United States. You said earlier that history has shown us, that the whole world could feel the impact of this. But who will be hurt most by these levies?
Well, I think we're going to see both companies and consumers hurt by it, although we're really exploring some new territory. I'll tell you, I'm literally so concerned about individual companies having to either absorb the costs associated with the tariffs or passing it on to the consumers. But I actually have joined with two very extraordinary pioneers in the area of supply chain management to be able to help individual companies try to traverse this very difficult period so that they try to minimize the amount of negative impact that they'll have with them. But we really we're in some ways in uncharted waters, because the president has talked about imposing tariffs all around the world, and that's something we haven't seen for a very long time.
And James, just to clarify, it's not just companies and consumers in the U.S., right?
Absolutely right. If we all of a sudden find ourselves in the middle of a trade war, we're going to see an impact that will be heard around the world. And ultimately, I think all of us will be losers.
And as we've also seen, tariffs beget more tariffs, right? You've, counter tariffs, retaliation, and if consumers are going to be paying the price at the very bottom line, why do it? What's the point of all of this?
Well, that's a good question. It's, if you poke me in the eye, I'm going to poke you in the eye. But, when we realize that over time, countries have used a series of actions in terms of subsidizing their industries, of dealing with currency, and so many different ways of trying to improve their own balance of payments. What ultimately has happened is that we have created a difficult situation which the United States says, look, we don't do that sort of thing, and now we are going to take you on. And that's exactly what President Trump campaigned on when he was running for president. And now that he's been in office for a little more than 5 weeks, we're now finding ourselves in the middle of a tariff and potentially a tariff war.
And we should also note that the Biden administration kept most of the earlier Trump administration's tariffs, right? Why is that?
Well, it's interesting because I think, quite frankly, President Biden was more sympathetic than not to what President Trump had put into place. But effectively, what he did was he just kept it in place. He didn't add to it. What we're dealing with now is that the president is adding an additional 10%, for example, tariff on China, 25% Canada and Mexico, something I don't think that President Biden would have ever thought of. But, it's interesting because we have I can remember when I flew up to Canada when we were in the midst of discussions of a U.S.-Canada free trade agreement. And indeed, we passed that, and then we turned to Mexico and created a NAFTA. And so we've been trying for a long time to be able to coordinate our efforts. And so car manufacturers like Ford, for example, have found themselves in a position where they were bringing in parts from Canada and from Mexico to be able to create a cheaper car. But now that there are going to be tariffs that are going to be imposed, that is going to have a striking effect.
So historically, have tariffs helped spur the U.S. economy?
Well, they did back in 1789, but this is not 1789. I think that really there's a desire to be able to come to an agreement that you need to be able to take away some of the uncompetitive actions that you've taken in the past to be able to compete with American companies. And if you don't, then we're going to take certain steps, and that's what President Trump is doing right now.
James, I wish we could continue, but our time is up. Thank you so much for your insight and your thoughts. James Moore, thank you.
My pleasure.